Hello, everybody. This is the Wednesday night class for this week. We're going to do lesson number 9 of the Proverbs, and you're going to want your lesson book with you that looks like this, lesson number 9. I know that's backwards, but and we're just going to fill in those blanks as we go. Again, this class isn't going to be nearly as fun because your comments and your impressions and your everyday examples always make our class great. We're just going to go through for about, I would say, 10 to 15 minutes on the subject of pride, rashness, and revenge in the Proverbs. So let's start with the first subject, which is pride. And there are 4 major Proverbs that talk about the subject of pride. The most famous one that I'm sure you've heard before is Proverbs 16, verses 18 through 19. Pride goes before destruction, and a haughty spirit before stumbling. It is better to be of a humble spirit with the lowly than to divide the spoil with the proud. So I'm sure we've all had experiences where we discovered that. Maybe we talked big before a soccer game, or told everybody we would get 100 on the test, and it turned out quite the opposite. That's nothing more than a tiny little experience about how we can be prideful about something and yet experience quite the opposite. It's a much bigger deal when it comes to our spiritual relationship with God, when we think we're more important than we really are. The next proverb is Proverbs 22 and verse 4. It says, "The reward of humility and the fear of the Lord are riches, honor, and life." So again, you see this pride and humility is mostly in the context of our relationship with God. Proverbs 17 and verse 5. "He who mocks the poor taunts his maker. He who rejoices at calamity will not go unpunished." For this one, I often think about being in my house when I was a kid. You've probably had a similar experience where your brother gets in trouble or your sister and you laugh about it, and your parents point to you and say, "Look out, because you're next," whether you did anything wrong or not. If you rejoice at somebody else's calamity, it often makes you a target of the same kind of punishment. So don't rejoice at somebody else's bad circumstances, not even when they deserve it. And also, don't ever mock the poor, because they have a God too, and a powerful God. And then finally, Proverbs 25 and verse 27. This is a simple illustration that says, "It is not good to eat much honey." Honey's great, a little spoonful of it, but if you had mouthfuls of it, it would be disgusting and overwhelming. And so if you imagine a mouthful of honey, while he says the next thing, "Nor is it glory to search out one's own glory." Nor is it good, to search out one's own glory. So it's like a sickening mouthful of honey when you're trying to get everybody to congratulate you because of your own pride. All right, I'm going to pause for a minute. And then here's one other proverb that goes along with that. It's actually not listed in the page. It's just a C also, but it's 27 and verse 2. And it's a great principle. It says, "Let another praise you and not your own lips, a stranger and not your own mouth." So good policy is to let other people recognize your good deeds, but as soon as you go around tooting your own horn, it just makes you look like a prideful person. So don't do that. All right, the second section of this list of Proverbs are the ones on rashness. And a good definition of rash is to do something or say something without thinking about it first. So rash words and angry actions we often do because we didn't stop and think. Lots of Proverbs talk about being careful not to do that. Proverbs 14, verses 29 through 30. "He who is slow to anger has great understanding, but he who is quick-tempered exalts folly. A tranquil heart is life to the body, but passion is rottenness to the bones." So it's a wonderful thing to be very, very patient and to be slow to anger. This goes right along with a passage you're probably familiar with from the New Testament, James chapter 1 and verse 19. And if we were in class, we would definitely be looking at that passage in our Bibles. James chapter 1 and verse 19 says, "This you know, my beloved brethren, everyone must be quick to hear, slow to speak, and slow to anger, for the anger of man does not achieve the righteousness of God. When I think of that, I often think of the fact that God gets mad for the right reasons at the right people to exactly the right degree at the right time. And we usually don't do that. We either get mad at the wrong people, or we do it for the wrong reason, or we do it at the wrong time, or we go way overboard or not far enough. God's anger is perfect, and it is righteous because, of course, God himself is perfect. So just be careful to be very, very slow to anger. A quick-tempered person is also a foolish person. The second proverb on the handout is Proverbs 16 and verse 32. And it reminds us that being able to control our anger is a part of the fruit of the Spirit, which is self-control. It says, "He who is slow to anger is better than the mighty, and he who rules his spirit than he who captures a city." So that's really powerful to be a warrior who can capture a whole city, but even more powerful to be a person who can rule himself, to be able to keep your passions in check and to be thoughtful and careful about all of your words and all of your decisions. You really are ruling a city because you're ruling yourself. And then finally in this list, Proverbs 19 and verse 11 says, "A man's discretion makes him slow to anger, and it is his glory to overlook a transgression." You know, sometimes it's just great to forget something ever happened and just agree to walk away and pretend it was not ever a big deal in the first place, to not have to force somebody else to give an account for each and every one of their insults and sins that they've committed, but to just overlook it, to know when to count your battles, when to say something and not to say something. That's a man's discretion that does that. Okay, I'm going to pause. And then there are these last two Proverbs that I have in the blank at the bottom of the page. And it asks the question, what are two related situations where being rash causes trouble? And we can think of a lot of situations, but these are two that the Proverb specifically talks about. The first one is Proverbs 20 and verse 25. And that proverb says, "It is a trap for a man to say rashly, 'It is holy,' and after the vows to make an inquiry." Now, in this case, to say something is holy means that it is separate for God. And so if you can imagine saying something off the cuff, like, if I'm able to sell this for $100, I'm going to give it all to God. And to not really think about the fact that maybe you needed that money to pay off a debt or to do something that was coming up, to just rashly say you're going to do that means you better follow through on that. It is a folly to be the sort of person who declares something to be holy or to declare something to belong to God without first really thinking whether he's going to follow through on that or not. A great passage that goes along with that is found in the book of Ecclesiastes, and it's in chapter 5 and verses 4 through 5, to just remind us to stop and think before we make promises to God. Ecclesiastes 5, verses 4 and 5. "When you make a vow to God, do not be late in paying it, for he takes no delight in fools. Pay what you vow. It is better that you should not vow than that you should vow and not pay." So God doesn't need anything from us. We don't have to make foolish promises or rash promises. God really just wants us to love him, serve him the way he asks us to, and be really careful about promising to God that you'll do things or give things when you haven't really stopped and thought about that. And then the other one that's on the piece of paper is Proverbs 25 and verse 8. Proverbs chapter 25 and verse 8. It says, "Do not go out hastily to argue your case. Otherwise, what will you do in the end when your neighbor humiliates you?" I always used to like to watch Judge Wapner on TV in the afternoons when I got home from school, the People's Court. And sometimes people were hasty to bring their neighbor to court over petty things. And it would have been much easier for everybody involved, for everybody to behave honorably. But because somebody got mad at the other one and they said, "I'm going to take you to court," they did it, and then they ended up losing the case because other cooler heads could see it from the other direction and realize who was really in the wrong. So Jesus actually has something to say about this in Matthew chapter 5 and verses 25 through 26. This is right in the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount. Matthew 25 verses 25 through 26 says, "Make friends quickly with your opponent at law while you are with him on the way, so that your opponent may not hand you over to the judge, and the judge to the officer, and you be thrown into prison. Truly I say, you will not come out of there until you have paid up the last cent." It's just good to make peace. It's good to be at peace with everybody, not to stiffen your neck and your back and to say, I'm taking you to court, or you're going to have to take me to court, or something like that. You just never know how that's going to end up when it goes into the hands of a jury or an unrighteous judge. So don't be rash. Don't be angry. It always turns out worse in the end. And finally, the last section in this chapter on the Proverbs is Proverbs on revenge. And we know, we've heard that many times from the New Testament, not to take our own revenge. It's a principle that you find in the Sermon on the Mount. It's a very important principle in the book of Romans. And I'm actually going to start this time by reading what Romans says, just to kind of give us an overall context for these individual proverbs we'll look at. Romans chapter 12, verses 17 through 21 says, "Never pay back evil for evil to anyone. Respect what is right in the sight of all men. If possible, so far as it depends on you, be at peace with all men. Never take your own revenge, beloved, but leave room for the wrath of God. For it is written, 'Vengeance is mine, I will repay,' says the Lord. But if your enemy is hungry, feed him. And if he is thirsty, give him a drink. For in so doing, you will heap burning coals on his head. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good." Now, a lot of people have questions over that last image about heaping coals on his head. We'll talk about it here in just a second. I think that it's pretty obvious that it's a genuine act of service. It's not some kind of an underhanded way to get even. But again, we'll talk about that in just a second. So the New Testament says never pay back evil for evil. And here we go with the Proverbs. Proverbs 20 and verse 22. "Do not say, I will repay evil. Wait for the Lord, and he will save you." So we want to look to God to take care of those problems, to bring justice for us. Proverbs 24, verses 17 through 18. "Do not rejoice when your enemy falls, and do not let your heart be glad when he stumbles, or the Lord will see it and be displeased and turn his anger away from him." We talked a few minutes ago about laughing when your brother gets a spanking. And it's the same kind of idea here, that if we rejoice when we see our enemy get his comeuppance, God may notice us and turn his anger toward the things we've been doing wrong the whole time too. Proverbs 24, verses 28 through 29. "Do not be a witness against your neighbor without cause, and do not deceive with your lips. Do not say, 'Thus I shall do to him as he has done to me. I will render to the man according to his work,'" which of course is really just a restatement of the principle we've been talking about. And then finally, the last one, that image that's so confusing. "If your enemy is hungry, give him food to eat." This is Proverbs 25, 21 and 22. "If he is thirsty, give him water to drink, for you will heap burning coals on his head, and the Lord will reward you." There have been a lot of different ways you can look in the commentators and the scholars about this. Some suggest that it's like when you kill a person with kindness, and you're always so sweet, and it just makes them madder and madder and madder. It's like their blood boils and their cheeks turn red. That this is an underhanded way of getting even at somebody. And that's just not what it's talking about at all. Some people suggest that the favor you're doing is when your neighbor's fire goes out, that one way you could help light their fire was to take a coal out of your own campfire or home and tote it over to their house by carrying it in a little pouch on top of your head. There's some evidence that that's the way they carried things. And I think that starts to get to be a little bit of a stretch to me, but maybe. certainly it's a very positive thing. It's the idea of providing warmth or something good for somebody who needs it. This isn't an underhanded way to get even with somebody. This is legitimate, well-meaning, good service for other people. It shouldn't surprise us to see that principle first stated in the Old Testament. This isn't just a New Testament idea, although Jesus, of course, makes it perfect in his example to us, the gift of his own life. But God has always behaved this way toward his children, always doing us good when we're acting as his enemies. So that's how he has called us to behave as well, to do good to those who persecute us, pray for those who are against us. Okay.